Good evening. My name is Kathleen. I'm one of the adult services librarians here at Trumbull Library. I just wanted to welcome you to our library and welcome you to this evening's program, What is Censorship, where we're going to discuss why it's important and how it's affecting individuals in our community. This program is hosted by the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force here in Trumbull, we partnered with them, this library, and we have a great panel of guests to discuss this really important topic, and we wanted to have this program during Banned Book Week. It was really important. And if you have any questions, for the last month, we had a box out in the library for you to write down any questions that you'd like. So we'll give it to Dr. Fleming for you guys for the panel. So feel free, if you would like, just write it down. There's a piece of paper in the back and put it in a box, and we'll get it to Dr. Fleming. Also, I just want to also mention, in partnership with the Edit team, we have a book club group. And that's our first meeting is November 6th at 6 p.m. in this room. We're going to be discussing Some of Us. If you've read it a couple of years ago or read it last week, please come. If you don't finish reading it, still come. We're going to have a great conversation about this book. And I'll be there, and hopefully you'll be there. And we have copies. If you don't have a copy, if you can't find a copy, please come here. We do have copies to check out for you. And that's it. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Fleming, who is the Vice Chairwoman of the Edit Task Force.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dr. Charlotte Fleming. Thank you to Kathleen and Amara and to our chair, Jonathan Trapp, and to the other members of the Edit Task Force that we collaborated for this event this evening. It's my pleasure to be here to be the moderator for the panel on censorship during Banned Books Week. The purpose of the Edit Task Force is to strengthen Trumbull's identity as a diverse, equitable, and inclusive community. And the task force is charged with identifying programmatic, community, and legislative practices with regard to racial, social, sexual, and gender equity and diversity. Our mission statement reads as follows. Trumbull's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force, also known as EDIT, seeks to foster a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive Trumbull where all residents will have and feel that they have opportunity and representation by listening to and engaging with community members, researching best practices, supporting education opportunities and initiatives, and advocating to improve inclusivity in Trumbull for all identities, including but not limited to identities based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, and ability. So tonight's panel discussion is a program that aligns directly with our stated purpose and mission. We have four wonderful panelists who are joining us tonight to share their perspectives on this important topic. And so I'd like to give each one of them a moment to introduce themselves. Representative Rutigliano, we'll start with you.
Good evening. My name is David Rutigliano. I'm the state representative from the 123rd, which is about 2/3 of Trumbull. I've been in office for a while. I'm deputy minority leader at this point, and I'm ranking member on the General Law Committee. So I basically focus on lots of things that have to do with the Department of Consumer Protection, and I do a lot of work with workforce development and other things like that. In my real life, I am a chef by trade, and I am in the restaurant business. So hopefully many of you have been to the Sitting Duck or one of my other great places, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
I'm Julia McNamee, and I think I would identify first as a mom of two daughters, and they're in their 20s, so of course we've thought about this topic for a long time. I was also a teacher for most of my career, a little bit an administrator. I teach a young adult novels class at Quinnipiac University for would-be teachers, and I'm currently on the Board of Education.
Hi, I'm Matt Braxic. I'm a teacher at Trumbull High School. Been there since 2005. I've been an English teacher up until this year, and I've made a transition to work with students on the tech side of things. So I teach auto shop, wood shop, and theater tech now. But I've always been very interested in this subject as a teacher, as a reader, as a father.
Hi, I'm Sarah Kitt, and I am a state representative for the 134th District, which encompasses about a third of Trumbull. I'm your newest representative. I was elected last November, so I have another year for you guys to decide whether or not to keep me. I am co-chair of the Children's Committee, which has a broad charter to handle issues related to children that are not covered by other committees, so it's wide-ranging from anywhere to school issues to Medicare services, Medicaid services. I also sit on the Human Services Committee, which primarily deals with disability issues and Medicaid, and the Public Health Committee, which covers just about everything else. I'm also the mother of 2 teenagers, a 19-year-old daughter and a 17-year-old non-binary child who is a senior at Fairfield Ward. I do live in Fairfield, but I am growing to love Trumbull more and more with every day that I spend here.
All right, thank you all so much for taking the time to be a part of our panel this evening. As Kathleen shared, the Edit Committee and the Trumbull Library intentionally chose to host this panel discussion during Banned Books Week. Banned Books Week is an annual event that highlights the value of free and open access to information. Banned Books Week is supported by a coalition of organizations that are dedicated to free expression, including public libraries. The American Civil Liberties Union defines censorship as the suppression of words, images, or ideas that are quote unquote offensive. The dictionary definition is substantively the same and reads, the suppression or removal of writing, artistic work, etc., that are considered obscene, politically unacceptable, or a threat to security. The ACLU suggests that censorship happens whenever some people succeed in imposing their personal, political, or moral values on others. Censorship can be carried out by the government as well as by private pressure groups, though censorship by the government is, of course, unconstitutional. So, with this common understanding, we are going to get into our discussion. So the first question for the panel, and panelists will always kind of start with Representative Tigliano and go on down, unless there's a question specifically for one of you, which we do.
You don't have to start with me. I'm not an expert, but I'm a little bit. Sometimes.
we can switch it up, that's fine. So the first question is, why is discussing censorship important?
Oh, I'm certainly not for censorship. I mean, I think it's always important to, as a community, to discuss what we find objectionable, or, you know, I don't know anybody who's for censorship per se. I don't know.
Thank you, Julia.
Are we allowed to ask questions or
To who?
each other?
We're going to just answer questions for now, but we may have an opportunity for that later.
So I think it's a really important question. I think censorship happens all the time, actually, and sometimes it's formal censorship actions, and sometimes it happens behind the scenes. But I think it's pretty constant in schools, at least, in terms of filtering in and out what we do and don't want students to see and hear.
Thank you.
Probably thinking about when I was growing up, I grew up in a very conservative household where we literally burned books. And I think about the impact that had on me, my development. And maybe it was one of the reasons why I ended up becoming an English teacher, is because I saw the power of language and how it motivated people to take such drastic symbolic actions. And I think it's important, as Representative Tigliano said, to always be checking with the community and to see where the community is on these subjects. And you know, morals change, mores change, and you know, we've seen change in our lifetime. And I think it's important to always revisit certain ideas and think about why things that we had thought at one point may be different.
I think I agree with everybody on this panel that censorship is not a good thing. All it does is keep us from learning and from growing and expanding our horizons. I agree with Julie here that there's always some sort of censorship. I censor myself when I'm talking with different groups. There are things I might say to one person that I might not say to another because of the circumstances. That's one form of censorship, which is personal. But when we're talking about state-sanctioned or government-sanctioned censorship, I think that's very dangerous. And we need to make sure there's a place for everybody to see themselves represented.
Thank you. Representative Kidd, I'm going to start with you and then come back this way because where you left off is where our next question picks up. Can you say a little bit more about how you see censorship affecting individual and community well-being?
One big issue that came before me on the Children's Committee this year was a bill regarding funding for libraries. And there was a motion to include the term sanctuary library in a statute, which raised the ire of a lot of people, and we had a hearing about it, and it was alarming how many people wanted to ban books at public libraries. And they said, this isn't censorship, it's protecting our children. But the books they were looking to ban were primarily books either written by or featuring gay or transgendered youth, or they were stories dealing with people of color and their lived experiences. And I found that to be very detrimental to a number of people, well, to our communities in general, because we had children who aren't seeing themselves represented, who are being told by people who are trying to ban these books that there's something wrong or there's something shameful about them that the rest of the community shouldn't be seeing or learning about. And I understand people's fear for their children, but that's why you read these books with your children. That's why you share them with your children, and you talk about it, and you learn about this together. And not every book is appropriate for every child. I absolutely agree with it. That's why parents need to be involved. But when we start talking about removing them from library shelves or putting them in restricted areas, that is censorship, that is banning it, and you are taking away a book from somebody because of your own personal beliefs. If you don't like that book, don't read it, don't buy it, but don't prevent somebody else from reading it and being able to access it. And some of these books have things about mental health and sexual health and reproduction, sex education books, things that children or teenagers, they're written for teenagers, who might be afraid to talk to their parents or go to a teacher or a nurse, and they want to read it for themselves. You take that information away from them so they can't make sound, safe decisions about their own well-being. So I think that's how censorship really can hurt our communities, especially our children.
I would probably just build on that with another personal experience. When I was younger, I would sneak around and read certain books. This was the 80s, and so books having to do with Dungeons and Dragons was seen as a gateway to the devil. And so when those books were taken from me and they were destroyed, one of the things that I had internalized was doubts about myself and my ability to pick books that were going to be good for me. And this is just escapist fantasy. No different than much of the hero quests that I was teaching in English class for many years. Fast forward to that, from being a child to now being a parent. There is one particular book called Gender Queer that becomes targeted time and time again in community after community. And so I became interested in this text, and I read it. And certainly it's hard-hitting. It is an autobiographical text about a person who is going through some real struggles about identity. And I learned so much from that book that I did not know before. And it made me a better teacher. It made me a better person, because now I was able to understand some of the difficulties that some of my students were going through. And just by coincidence, it also prepared me for the next big jump in my life, which was one of my children coming out as transgender. And so inadvertently, this text had helped to prepare me to make the adjustments that I needed to make in order to properly support my child when they needed that support the most. And I just think about how if you lose that, then you lose the opportunity and the access to these different perspectives. And there's very real value in learning other people's perspectives, because they're not your own. I mean, that's kind of the whole thing. there's a whole world out there that we can't possibly know the fullness of unless we're seeing it through the eyes of other people. And that's all art: paintings, literature, plays, music.
Politics.
The art of politics, sure.
Yeah.
And all that stuff helps to add to our understanding of the world around us, of the people around us, and helps us to become more fully human.
I think about this a lot as a teacher, or as a former teacher, just thinking about the students whom I've taught in my classrooms. And when I think about the well-being of a community, I think about freedom. I think about everyone being able to choose to live the lives that they lead and how important that is. And I think about kids having a chance, and by kids usually I mean like high school students or maybe middle school students, whatever, but kids being able to figure out who they are and how they want to live their lives. And as long ago as 30 years ago, and this tells you how old I am, I taught a young woman, and she borrowed from me the book, The Bluest Eye, which was in my classroom library. And it's a short novel by Toni Morrison that is frequently banned because it has as its subject, main character was repeatedly raped by her father. And it's a very sad story. And this young woman came to me, I still remember so vividly, to tell me, she was crying, to tell me how much the book had meant to her because she had been raped that summer. And that book gave her a way to see herself and to process what had happened to her, and so on. And I guess I think about the books that tend to get banned or censored tend to be books either written by or for those who are most vulnerable and most powerless in our communities. And those are the folks who I think often need it the most. And I feel as if we have librarians who are professionals who read reviews and know the books that in general are best for all of the different communities of our children. And that's really helpful to us as a community. I just think that when you think about the whole community and the importance of each individual, I'll just tell you one last little story. In the 90s, when the first Harry Potter book came out, someone I was close to worked for Trumbull Schools and was working with what books to put on the summer reading list. And the question was whether to put this first Harry Potter book on the Trumbull summer reading list. And the person who was in charge of the decision-making did not want it to be on the list because of its references to witches and the occult, and fears that there would be backlash from some Christians in our community. And at the very last second, they changed their minds and put that on book list. And there are issues people have with J.K. Rowling at this point, which I think are well-founded, but there's so many children whose lives were positively impacted by reading Harry Potter. And so this is just an example of an enormous group in our community that came very close to being affected.
I'm not sure exactly where I would come into this discussion. I have my own opinion about things. I'm a little bit of a freedom absolutist. I don't think the Trumbull Public Library should ban a book ever. I think as a community we have a discussion about maybe where a book belongs. Does genderqueer belong in young adult? Does it belong in teenager? I think that's an appropriate conversation. But I wouldn't advocate at all for the banning of a book. I mean, listen, let's be frank. I'm a Republican, right? I get censored all the time. I try writing a letter to the Connecticut Post. Try writing a letter. We don't publish our stuff. They suppress our ads on Facebook. I guarantee you right now, the Trumbull Library doesn't have a copy of the new Scott Adams book, right? But they'll have 20 of Obama's last book. This stuff happens all the time. I mean, so I'm kind of used to it on another angle. But if you wanted to just, I don't know where this discussion goes. I feel like it's really about gender or whatever, which is fine. But I'm not for banning a book about anything. But I don't know if that book might be appropriate for a 5-year-old. I think that's a legitimate discussion. That was the only thing that I would add to that discussion. is that as a community, I think it's appropriate for us to have it. That's all.
As panelists, feel free, of course, to speak your own truth as we go through all of these questions. So everything is welcome. My next question was about personal experience with censorship, but you've all touched on that as you've discussed already, so I'm going to jump ahead. This next question is for Matt and Julia specifically, as you both have experience working with public schools in the state, or here in town even. So what has been your experience with either censorship or the banning of books within your work in public schools? And what have you seen the reaction be in your experience to this growing fight over, what young people can and should or should not read?
Probably the most stark case, classic case, would be discussions that we had back in end of 2012, beginning of 2013, when the school decided to put on a production of the musical Rent. And there were people in the community who were concerned about that. It was a very different time. It was a different town administration, different school administration, different board of education. And there were a lot of conversations about that between teachers, administrators. It did boil over into the public at large. Board of Ed meetings, then the media got a hold of it, and that was a completely different thing. The concerns were that we weren't sure if the students who were going to be portraying these characters on stage were going to be able to handle some of the topics that they were about. So for people that might not know what Rent is about, it is a play that deals with some people in New York City in the 80s, and it deals with topics such as homosexuality, drug use, AIDS, and just trying to make it work as a group of struggling artists. So there were also poverty issues there too. And I feel that was a real concern. Would the students, 14, 15, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, would they be able to portray these characters and then have a little bit of a separation between their real life in this community and the lives that they were playing on stage? And one of the things that we say about theater is that it's rehearsal for real life. And studies show that people who engage in theater and who produce theater, that they develop empathy that isn't always exhibited in the population at large. Again, what you were saying about having this conversation, I think, was very appropriate. And for a while, it was decided that we weren't going to do this. There was considerable pressure brought to the Board of Education at that time, and we made some adjustments. And some of the adjustments that we made had to do with addressing that one particular issue. How are we going to prepare our students to be able to handle topics of this nature? And we did a lot of programming. We brought in members of the family, of the writer of the play, the musical, to come in and talk about him, friends of him, other theater, other people who make theater, came in and spoke to us. It ended up being, quite an experience for our students to be able to hear from so many different experts on Broadway at that time. Another concern, of course, was that this show is open to the entire community. Parents love to bring their kids to it. I don't know if you've ever seen a spring musical production, but it's kind of over the top sometimes. Someone who is in charge of putting together the technical stuff, it can be quite an experience. And I know that parents want to bring their kids to come and see this. And so there were some questions about, well, would that shut other people out? And these are, once again, really good conversations to have, legitimate conversations to have. One of the things that came out of that for me personally, though, was a moment when our students were having a conversation with the principal at the time. And he was explaining what some of the concerns were about the community. And one of the students, he was a sophomore at the time, so if you're experienced with 15-year-olds, they don't always phrase their questions or their concerns or in a way that is level-headed. And he was gay. And he asked the principal, he said, "Are you telling me that I am a problem in the community?" And I had never heard that before. I had never experienced anything like that before. I was totally floored by the question that the student was asking. And of course the principal said, "No, not at all. He didn't. There's no way that he could do his job and see certain students as a problem in the community." But what it said to me was that when this student was experiencing that moment of censorship, that he internalized it and he got a message from it that I don't think that anyone in the community was trying to send. And the message that he received was that the community didn't want to talk about the presence of people like him in a school setting, even though he was a high school student. And it seemed to me that he was experiencing this separation. I'm too young to perform as a gay person on stage, but I am a gay person. And that was a really difficult thing for him to handle. And I don't remember too much more from that meeting, but that has always stood out to me. Again, as I said, we finally did perform it. It was an incredible experience for our students. I think it really transformed our theater program. I think it really injected it with a vibrancy that we are still living on today, 10 years later. And it was fun. The community loved it. We sold out a theater of 1,000 seats several times. And I think we've survived as a community. So I appreciate the opportunity to have that conversation. I appreciate the opportunity to think about, well, what are we doing on the back end for these students to prepare them for some of the roles that they do. And so since then, we have developed in the curriculum a dramaturgy program that the students can take, which explores the history and the topics of whatever plays that they are working with. A technical theater program for the students who want to be involved on the back side of things, the side that I deal with, the technical side of things. An American musical class, which explores the history and the prominence of the American musical as an art genre that is unique to this country and has been exported to other countries. And a performance class for students who might not have the time or the willingness to get on stage in front of a whole audience of people, but who want to experience that moment of stepping into someone else's shoes for a little while and walking a mile. And so I really see that as being an important moment in our community.
That was great. It was a good show. It was a really good show.
Yeah, it really was.
I think that, as an administrator, the answer was always very simple. If a parent was concerned about a book that was being taught as a whole class novel or a book club novel, we always, and I think all school systems do this, offered an alternative book that the student could read instead. So there was never a question of students having to read a book because a teacher chose it. But I think what did happen a lot and does happen a lot is what I've always called preemptive censorship. So it's where a book gets, without going through any process or not even necessarily a book, it could be, as you said, a play or other things in the community, get cut out because people are afraid usually of opposition. And I've seen that a lot. A book we were not allowed to teach at one school I taught at for many years was Kite Runner, because we had someone who was very worried that parents would be upset about a rape scene in the novel. And eventually we were allowed to teach it, but there was never a complaint or anything like that. He was just afraid of the complaint. And I had the same thing happen with another collection of short stories where an administrator who had had a censorship issue raised 15 years previously was so afraid that she didn't want to let us teach it. So I think that's a problem, because then you never have that discussion about whether the book should be taught. I think you have a lot of teachers right now who are afraid of teaching books, certain books, like they would be nervous to teach a book because they worry, especially right now with our polarized situation. I read somewhere that the number of books that have been that people have sought to have banned or that have been banned rose something like 20% in the last year, which was just shocking to me. And to respond to partly what Representative Ritigliano was saying, some of them are books that are about LGBTQ kids and identity and things like that, but a lot of them are actually books by Black authors who are writing about contemporary issues like racial profiling and police shootings and things like that, and they never see the light of day. Teachers are too afraid to teach them. And I think sometimes, there are complaints behind the scenes, and a librarian will just go and pull a book, or a principal will take it off the shelf, or, individuals raise questions. And so we never even know how the community feels because it's not a discussion, and people aren't allowed to weigh in. So, I guess what I'm saying is individual children, I don't think there's ever an issue with class books because there always is an alternative. The questions come with what you're allowed to teach, what you feel safe teaching, and what happens behind the scenes. So there are a lot of layers to this, is what I guess I would say.
Thank you. So, Matt, the story you told and the one you mentioned earlier with the bluest eye, which is directly connected to the next bit. So, in the field of education, many educators consider the importance of windows and mirrors in literature. And this concept refers to the idea that it's essential for all students that educators bring diverse voices and perspectives into their learning spaces. So a window refers to, of course, something that you can see the world through. And so texts that teachers put in front of students that fall into that sort of idea share that same perspective, right? Looking out and seeing something else. Mirrors, of course, allow us to see ourselves. And so they show us what we look like and let us examine ourselves. And they can give us a glimpse into ancestry, heritage, and other lived experiences. Sometimes a mirror can show you a part of yourself that you didn't notice before. And there's beauty and importance in that. And when choosing stories, they should reflect, ideally, images of our students' multiple identities and the world that they are a part of. So this is for anyone. What is your reaction to this idea of the concepts of windows and mirrors in literature?
I think it's a beautiful concept. It helps us to see the world around us and our role within it. And sometimes that role can be good, sometimes that role can be not so positive. And when we do take the time to look at our relationship to the outside world, it's a chance for personal growth, it's a chance for community growth. It's really a way to connect to other people that you might not have interacted with or connected with previously, and really opens up pathways to understanding, a lot of which has been lost in the last few years as we become more polarized. And I myself try to read material that offers a different perspective of mine, so I can try to understand where other people are coming from and how what I might say or do impacts other people, because we don't live in bubbles. And when we block our children's access to these windows and these mirrors, we're not preparing them for a life in the real world. They're not going to know how to interact with people who might not look like them or think like them or talk like them. And it's such a rich world out there, so I think it's really important that we foster this sense of windows and mirrors in our schools as well as in our own personal lives.
I generally have, I don't know if it's more nuanced, I just have a different opinion about certain things. So I don't really judge anything good or bad. I think you should read everything. Really, I am a lifelong user of the library. I'm a big proponent. I thought the administration with rent was overblown, by the way, because it was the high school version to begin with. It was already toned down, so it was all a whole lot of nonsense. I don't particularly care for rent, but it's a little depressing. Footloose was fantastic, you know. Big happy jingles are always good, right? So I believe that the Trumbull Public Library should be as open, as free as possible. Should never be restricted. It should be really a community asset that people get to use all the time because it's public, it belongs to us, it's its mission. The school system is a workplace. It is a workplace where the curriculum and the books that people read are directed by the people who employ everybody, the Board of Education, the administration. They have a goal in mind, kids are supposed to learn, yada, yada, yada. If they give the teachers some autonomy on what to teach, fine, let them do it. That's the way it should be. So, but I don't believe the library in the school is the same as this library because it's not open and free to everyone. It is in somebody's work environment. That's my approach to the difference between school and here. So I know sometimes we like to say, well, maybe we have censorship or a banned book in a school environment. I don't agree, actually. It's a workplace environment. If that book was banned here, I would be very concerned. If the administration or the Board of Ed, the people that run our school system, they're the ones that should determine what the kids are learning, what the curriculum is, and what's in the library. It's not a free space. It's a bunch of minors who are, I don't want to use force, but they are compelled to be there, and their parents are involved while they're there. It's different than here. Here is a public space. It should be open to everybody and should have everything. So I think that's just sort of my beginning premise that I use to start. So, and I know there's certain teachers, we've experienced a little bit in my household. I have two kids that both went to Trumbull High. Now I have my older son. He was a big reader, but he would read the craziest stuff that you could ever imagine, right? So he was a big fan of those killing books. So Bill O'Reilly, killing Lincoln, killing whatever he's reading, I figured what the heck, right? So it was open reading in English, and that's the book. He was forbidden to read the book. That book wasn't the right book. It was supposed to be some other book. Even though it was an open reading period there in English, his book wasn't the correct one. So, you know, listen, it sort of had, and I guess that's the teacher's prerogative. It was her class. She was running it the way she wanted to because it wasn't a free environment. I hope I made my point, and that's that.
I find that very surprising because as a sophomore teacher, we had the same thing, and I had students who were reading stuff like that. I think in part to try to get a rise out of me, to be honest with you. They would come up and they would look, I'm reading Karl Marx, and it's like, oh, okay, great. You want me to read that with you? And
got a rise out of it.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think people should read everything. You know, I think that my role, I'm the guy that's forcing kids to read certain things because they're not going to read it on their own. And it kind of goes back to that idea about mirrors and windows. And it's kind of my responsibility, I feel, to kind of force kids to read things that they might not have read otherwise. And so I totally value, you know, anyone, like you said, he's reading, right?
Fair enough. Right.
So you know, if he wants to read that stuff, I
appreciate, I think you helped make my point maybe because I wasn't as nuanced as I should. You were forcing. It just shows you you're not in a free space.
Right.
You're in a controlled space. Where this building, in my opinion, should be a free space.
Yeah, I think there's a balance too, which is why we had the free reading at the beginning, where you could read whatever you wanted to read. And then there were things that I was forcing you to read. You know, I haven't had too many kids come back and say, thank God we read Lord of the Flies. I really enjoyed that.
But again, that book was approved by a curriculum committee that you forced them to, them to read. The teacher saying you can't read this book during free reading is censorship, and I think is absolutely inappropriate. Because, there was thought and expertise put into approving this curriculum.
Right.
And if a book is in the library, in a school library, no one's forcing a child to go read a book in the library that hasn't been approved as part of a curriculum per se. It's very different. Those are two different situations. Following
It's
a
still in a
curriculum.
building that's not open to the public, where kids are compelled to be there
But they're
without
not
their
compelled.
parents.
They're not compelled to go to the library.
I understand. I guess my point is that I believe a school library is a controlled environment that can be controlled by duly elected people and hired by the Board of Education. They do the curriculum committee, they do all that other stuff. Where the Trumbull Public Library is a free space, and there should be no such restriction. That's my thought process on it. I guess this is a discussion, you can disagree, of course, but when people ask me, well, what about this book here, or what about this book there? I'm like, well, where is it? If it's here, listen, it's a library. There's all sorts of things here.
Julia, I know you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I
Feel
just
free.
wanted to say, I was trying to make that distinction before about what's a required book in a classroom, where I think there should be latitude for students to be able to read something else. Honestly, I do, because I don't think kids should be compelled to read anything specific. But I guess where I would disagree a little, I don't think every book in the world should be in a school library.
Yes.
Absolutely, right? That makes no sense at all. But I guess what I do think is we have librarians who are professionals whom we hire, who have education and ongoing education with professional development to decide which books go into our school libraries. And some of those may be objectionable to some people, and it's true, their parents aren't there with kids to help them choose books. So it throws the problem back somewhat to parents to have conversations with their children about what kinds of books they would like their family to be reading. And I think that's an important job of a parent. The other side of it is we know that some of those vulnerable communities I talked about earlier have much higher levels of depression and suicide. And so for schools whose primary job is care and education of students, it's so important to make sure that those books are present in our libraries, which is no doubt why some of the books that we've even talked about tonight, got very favorable reviews with the School Librarian Journal and some of the other professional magazines that review books. And I understand if you don't want your child to read it, that's fine, but these national highly qualified journals have said these belong in a school library. They're important to have in a school library.
Thank you.
I would disagree.
So so where would you draw the line?
I would draw the line between a public library and a school library. So I believe it's up to the Board of Education, which you are a member of, to do their job. If you choose to put that book in there, okay, fine. But that's at least a community conversation.
So I'm gonna bring us to
It's
the
fine.
next bit of information. Julia, earlier you talked of some data and statistics, so I wanted to share a little bit of that here next. So the American Library Association's Office of Intellectual Freedom documented that there were 1,269 demands to censor library books and resources in 2022. And that is the highest number of attempted book bans since the ALA began compiling data about censorship in libraries more than 20 years ago. And the unparalleled number of reported book challenges in 2022 nearly doubles the 729 book challenges in 2021. Censors have targeted a record 2,571 unique titles in 2022, which is a 38% increase from the 1,858 unique titles that were targeted for censorship in 2021. And of those titles, the vast majority were written by or about members of the LGBTQIA+ community, or by and about Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. Representative Kidd, I want to come back to you because you talked a little bit to us about the bill that came before you. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that bill and sort of what the status is at this time?
We did take out the language regarding sanctuary libraries. Personally, I believe all libraries should be sanctuaries, and as long as we're not banning books, and then they are. The bill passed with the caveat that libraries have to have a clear policy for how books can be challenged and what the appeal process is, which I believe the Connecticut Library Association already has recommended is their policy. So state grants for libraries will go forward. So we're glad that we were able to get it through. And not to harp on what we were talking about before, in the school libraries, I understand that's a different thing. We have elected school boards who approve the curriculum, and they hire the librarians who are trained to pick these books. So there is a process that does trickle down. Does every member of the school board have a say in what book is in that library? That's probably a discussion we should have, but at the same time, you all elected your school board members to hire the people that have the expertise and the knowledge to decide which books are age appropriate for each grade level, each school. But I have to say the discussions at the hearings were troubling about what children, and when I say children, we're talking high school kids, should be allowed to learn. And that worries me. I mean, I could say I want, the Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged banned because it preaches authoritarian themes that I find troubling. But I still believe, I wouldn't read it. I don't recommend it to my kids, but you want to read it, have at it. You think your kids should read it, have at it. And when we say you can't have those in the school library, not every kid can get to the public library for different reasons, whether they don't have transportation or their parents don't allow it. And I think it's dangerous when we start telling kids what they can and cannot explore. And again, there are already safety rails put in, guardrails put in, and excuse me if I'm not being completely articulate, it's been an extremely long week. But there are guardrails in our school systems about what books are in our school libraries. And yes, some of them are challenging, and they challenge our values, but that's what good books and good literature should do. They should challenge us.
Well, I would highly recommend Atlas Shrugged and the Fountainhead. Phenomenal books. I've read both of them multiple times. So just to hit a point, right? Those challenges, one could say that the people that came before you, that you were disturbed, were exercising their free, I'm not saying I agree with them.
Yeah.
They're exercising their free speech. We're having an open hearing. They're allowed to say what they want. Doesn't mean they get what they want. The same thing with the people who challenge things. Like, do I think they should challenge all those books? Absolutely not. But they were exercising their, now they might get denied, but just like somebody, you would say, has the freedom to pick up a book, they had the freedom to object to a book, whether I agree with them or not. And I would agree, our public hearing process in the legislature is boisterous and long and nuanced sometimes, and in fact, it goes into the last person. It's a beautiful system we have in Connecticut, because I've been in hearings that last 20 hours, because we stay till the last person speaks, and no bill could get passed until we have that hearing. So I think it's good. And then so we as a legislature, Sarah, take in the information, and then we decide how to craft the legislation, and then it moves out of committee, and then it goes, then it gets deliberated by the entire House. So I think the process works. We may not like the fact that people are objecting. People object to a lot of things that I don't like, books or no books, but at least there's a process. So.
Thank you. So there are some who say that restrictions are necessary in our public schools and public libraries to protect our children. And this can particularly come up when materials concern sexuality, in particular as it may be the case with certain LGBTQIA+ themes and content. Parents who have concern about this, and sometimes other community members express concerns about age-inappropriate materials. I mean, I think you all have been careful to name that we're generally talking about high schoolers, right, in this context, young adult books, et cetera. Anyone want to add any additional thoughts as it comes to that particular subject matter, as that tends to come up pretty frequently in this conversation?
I live in Newtown, and we just recently went through this entire process. There were a couple of books that were challenged by members of the community, And it got brought before the board, and a committee was appointed to review the books, and they made a recommendation to the Board of Education. And it was a months-long process, and you know, full disclosure, I was there for most of the Board of Ed meetings. I spoke out several times. In the end, I think it was a really good conversation to have, since we keep talking about this idea of community conversations. The students came out and they spoke very honestly and eloquently about their thoughts and their feelings. And so if for no other reason than to just give high school students a real-world opportunity to exercise some of these civic rights and civic duties, I thought that the conversation had merit. The committee was appointed by the Board of Education. No, I'm sorry. The committee was appointed by the superintendent, who obviously is hired by the Board of Education. It was made up of the assistant superintendent, a couple of the school librarians, a couple of teachers, and they read the books that were being challenged, and they took into consideration all of the concerns that were raised by the challenges, and what they ended up saying unanimously was there is some troubling subject material in this text, but when you read it in context, there is an important, legitimate reason for this material. And I go back to thinking about some of the things that I teach, or did teach, to students for all those years. You know, Macbeth has several murders, a haunting.
It's now 7:55. The library will close in 5 minutes. Please check out all materials.
In case you were wondering.
Tomorrow, Friday between 9 and 5. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to take up all the time there. And there were members of on the Board of Education who, even in the face of a unanimous unanimous recommendation from the committee to keep these books in the library, they insisted that that they felt that it did not belong there, and so the community had to make a stand on this. And so what happened was the community came out and we made it very clear by a very large number that we felt that our students could handle these texts and that they were important texts. And of course the irony is that these texts had never been checked out in the library. One was in the library for 10 years and was checked out one time 7 years ago, and the other one was never checked out.
How many times was it checked out after this whole?
Yeah.
You can't get it.
Same thing happened with Fairfield Public Library.
Oh, there's a benefit.
One
You're
was,
talking about a school library, you're talking about a public library.
School.
Right, but the same thing happened in our public
Public
library.
library.
Big kerfuffle over a book that had been on the shelves for a number of years and been checked out once.
so one of the texts was Flamer, which is the semi-autobiographical graphic novel depicting a boy who was growing up in, I can't remember if it was the 70s or the 80s, but it was a time when coming out was very fraught. And his experience trying to wrestle with feelings that he was having, friendships he was trying to have, being alienated from other groups. And the other one was called Blankets, which I also read. And it was another tale about teenage alienation and identity, and again, these are texts that these are not texts I teach in my class, but they are similar themes and similar concepts to what I teach in class. And we have a robust debate about the text in our English department meetings. We have a robust debate about the text that we teach. We teach Catcher in the Rye, which is a seminal text on identity and trying to figure out your place in the world. And it's an American classic, and it's getting outdated. The kids don't understand it anymore. they have a hard time identifying. Even when we talk about, okay, so this is what's really happening to him right now. He's feeling bad for everybody else. He wants his sister to remain in a glass case because he doesn't want her to grow up, because he doesn't want her to experience all the bad things that he's experienced growing up. And my students are like, I get that, but it's not my thing. And the reason why people keep writing on this same subject is because we are all experiencing it at one point or another. And for each one of us, that entry point is different. We're going to keep teaching Catcher in the Rye for the foreseeable future, but you know, not everyone's going to find their identity journey in that text. You know, if we're serious about giving students the opportunity to discover who they are, then there has to be a way for them to make these explorations, whether it's the school library or whether it's individual reading time at the beginning of English class. You know, just to figure out what is it that they like, who are the authors that speak to them, what are the subject matters, what are the storylines. Do they like Harry Potter? Do they like nonfiction? What are they into?
That was a great segue to what will be our last question, as lady upstairs says. We did open up an opportunity for folks to submit questions. We got a couple, but I'm going to move us to just one last question for you all since we're running out of time, which is to share that the theme for Banned Books Week this year is Let Freedom Read. So I'd love to have each of you, starting with Representative Partigliano and going on down, to talk about what does this mean to you? What does that theme mean to you or say to you as you consider banned book censorship and its impact on our society?
Well, I really think that you all should reconsider your censorship of conservative thought in the Trumbull Library, because I got to tell you, if you go there to look for a book, you barely have one by Newt Gingrich. And I've seen 20, the Clinton book, we had 22 the year it came out, the same book. I'm just telling you, I think we should all be introspective about what we decide to do and not to do, and what books we decide to have. Because I'm a big user of the Libby app, so I see what you have all the time. I'm here, and I'm into the library. And I think that all censorship is bad, and that we should consider that there is some soft censorship even on the other side, just in the quantity available and what's available. I mean, I would imagine you probably have one copy of Fountainhead, maybe, if we're lucky. Maybe.
I don't work at the library, so I'm not.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We teach it in the school.
Good for you, as you should, because it's not authoritarianism, it's rugged individualism, let's be honest. So, I think these are good conversations to have. I think that we should all, as we walk away from this, consider what we want in the school as opposed to in our public library. I thought it was my one reason for coming, because I felt that it was an important point to make, and I don't believe they're equal. And I'll end with that.
Thank you, Julia.
I will just say I don't think anybody has said it's equal, and I certainly don't either. I don't think every book here should be in the school library. I guess what I would say, though, is that I think, you know, I'm sure, you know, everyone needs to speak to what they think is important. Whether probably Representative Partigliano has already put in his word to the library asking for certain books to be bought, as all of us can, right? If you want certain books, you can ask for them, and they will usually buy them. And by the same token, I do think that there is sometimes incorrect perceptions about what our community wants. So if you want certain things in your community, you need to let your library board, your Board of Ed members, the representatives, you need to let people know where you stand. And by that I mean things like emails to politicians and board members, comments at public meetings or hearings, writing letters to the editor. They may or not get published.
Never do.
Yep. Get involved. You know who you're voting for, where they stand on certain issues, you know. So if you want to let freedom ring, you got to be aware, right? You got to really know what's there. Read the books. Don't just depend on some network guy telling you it's bad, right? Read it.
Or Amazon review. Right?
What?
Or a dumb Amazon review.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Dumb Amazon. I agree with that.
Freedom means different things to different people, and a lot of times where one person's freedom ends, another person's freedom is cut off. And so, again, I think this idea of community conversations is absolutely essential. Listening with open ears. And as a high school teacher for 20 years, I've had a unique opportunity to do that to our students, or to do that with our students, to listen to them when they speak. And as a teacher, I walk away educated, inspired, amazed, and as a parent, I'm terrified. Because our kids are going through some really tough stuff sometimes. Certainly more difficult than what I had to go through when I was their age. And they can handle it. And when they're living these lives, to suggest that they can't read about it in books because they can't handle it, that creates that dichotomy, that friction within, when they start to doubt the experience that they are actually having. Which is not to suggest that I think we should trust all high school students to do whatever they feel like doing, because that's a
Not a great recipe for disaster.
Exactly. But certainly to trust the experts, to do the research, to think deeply about these things, and to continue having these kinds of conversations.
To me, I think freedom to read really means just that, allowing people to read the books that they want to read. And for our kids, again, guardrails, the age-appropriate books, but some of the best conversations I've had with my children have been after they've read books of their choosing that may or may not be aligned with my thought process. I do have Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged on our bookshelf. My youngest chose to read it, and we had a discussion about it, and they formed their own opinions. And it's amazing how much we all grow when we trust each other to think, to read, to learn. When we go back to find out, did that person really say that, or are those facts true? I'm going to go find out. I'm going to read the original source. And I've had my opinion changed and my worldview shifted many times from what I've had available to me. And the more opportunities we have to read and learn about those different worldviews, it just opens it up and brings us closer together. And it's something we need now more than ever, because we're all in our bubbles and it's dangerous and isolating.
If you don't mind, can I say one more thing that I think we all could agree on, right? I would be, as a parent, I am way more concerned about what my kids are watching on YouTube than any book they can get.
Yep.
I also think that 10 years from now, we're going to look at this is just like we look at cigarettes. It's just one of the most dangerous things, and every one of our kids walks around with it. So as much as I might have a problem with a couple of books, I have way more problem with this and YouTube.
Yes.
So, and I think we're all shaking our heads, yes, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you all so much for being here. Julie, I appreciate you talking about what actions one might take. So I just wanted to share with everyone here that on Saturday, October 7th, coming up at the end of this week, the coalition that supports Banned Books Week is asking those who care to take at least one action to help defend books from censorship, and to stand up for library staff, educators, writers, publishers, and booksellers who make these books available. And so this could include calling decision makers, it could be talking to school librarians or school administrators, school boards, et cetera, council persons, elected representatives, and supporting advocacy organizations. So we encourage those of you here tonight, those who may be watching this recording at some other point in time, to take an action if you feel so moved to do so. So this brings us to the end of our panel discussion tonight. Thank you very much to our panelists for being here and sharing your perspectives, to the Public Library, to the Trumbull Edit Committee, and to all of you in the audience for taking the time to be here tonight. If you have other ideas for programs that you would like to see the Edit Committee bring to the community, please let us know. And we will be launching, as Kathleen shared, our book club with The Sum of Us on November 6th in this very room. copies are available and available on the Libby app if you choose to use that as well. So please come join us for that discussion and let freedom read. Thanks for being here.